Hi there, I'm Scott and this is GreatScott Knitting Dyes Yarn episode 13. Today I am going to be dyeing two skeins of Dyer Supplier 7525 Superwash Merino Nylon Blend Fingering Weight yarn. I'll be dyeing this using food coloring on both skeins. The first skein I'm going to be using a stencil and some spray bottles on a sock blank that I have created using my own knitting machine. I'm soaking that in a solution of vinegar water to prepare it for the process. I'm going to lay out this first skein that is in a sock blank on a flat surface with some saran wrap underneath it so that I can get started with spraying and speckling this yarn. I'm going to start by mixing my food coloring for the dye that I'm going to be placing on the yarn. I am placing about 5 drops of Wilton's Color Right food coloring into 100 milliliters of warm water, and then I'm going to put those into my condiment bottles. I'll eventually transfer the dye into my spray bottles, but this allows me to basically keep it organized, and because the spray bottles are relatively small, I can then allocate different amounts into the spray bottles as I need it. So I'm going to transfer my dye into my spray bottles. And it looks like I'm going to make a mess at the same time. Yeah, looks like my condiment bottle that my yellow dye is in appears to have some leakage issues. And, well, you know, that's just one of the natures of when you try something new, you have to learn. And I'm learning that I need to clean up after myself quite a bit. So I'm going to test out my spray bottle real quick. Number one, to make sure that I can get the dye through and kind of to test the color. And yep, there's the color. And now I'm going to grab my stencil and put that on my sock blank. All right, so I'm going to start this process of stenciling using a spray bottle and a paper stencil that I made myself by cutting out a set of leaves that I had printed on a piece of paper. I do not know how well this will work. If it will stencil enough or if it'll just bleed out, I don't know. So I started with my yellow. I'm going to now try a different kind of spray bottle. This is a hand sanitizer spray bottle that I'm repurposing to do this. And let's see if it actually stencils. Oh, it does. Okay, I'm actually very surprised that it's working and also very pleased. So I'm just going to continue to do this. This larger spray bottle, I'll have to say, it's much more diffuse, and my smaller hand sanitizer spray pen I seem to have a bit more control over where that dye goes. So I am going to be transferring into some red dye for this final leaf on this point of stenciling. It's giving me some trouble. Try again here. There we go. And again, it seems that this larger bottle, the spray is much wider than the little pin, but I like how it's turning out. So I'm going to move my stencil. I'm going to turn it over so it's a little bit, has sort of a different pattern. And I'll continue this process of spraying and switching colors on this stencil. have to say that this was so much fun that my spouse wanted to get in on the action. So my husband picked up a spray bottle and stenciled along with me. As you can see, there's a lot of dye and moisture collecting on the stencil. So my spouse had a brilliant idea of taking some paper towel and lightly dabbing over the entire thing to pick up that excess dye so that it wouldn't drip. And it also happened to just neatly pick the stencil up, which then I could easily peel off of the paper towel and apply it back to the last part of my yarn blank so I could continue stenciling. And he's pointing out how he helped prevent the drips and extra splotches by his ingenious technique. Now I'm going to add some homemade sugar sprinkles in green and black and brown into the white spaces in between the stenciled leaves, just to add some additional color and interest to this skein. Now, by no means am I going to cover the entire skein with color. There will be some white space left in it, but I do want to kind of give a little bit more interest and not so many big bold blotches of white. So I'm adding some additional speckles using colored sugar sprinkles. Now, as you can see, I'm simply using my hands to do this speckling so that I have a lot of control over where this color goes. I am not wearing gloves because it is food coloring, and yes, my fingers are getting dyed, which means I'll need to wash my fingers and make sure not to touch the yarn with my fingers so I don't get these big ugly splotches that I don't want. So I'm going to be continue adding some speckles in the brown and black and green on this side of the sock blank. And when I'm done, I'll let it sit for a bit for the speckles to absorb into the fiber. And then I'm going to flip the skein over, and because I'm curious as to how much has penetrated to the other side in terms of how much dye has penetrated to the other side, and maybe even add some speckles to that side as well if it is still relatively clear of color. So now I'm just going to add the final little bits of speckles, and then I'll let it sit and let these speckles absorb. So while off camera, I have covered the skein of yarn in an additional sheet of some plastic wrap. And now I've decided to go ahead and steam it before looking at the backside and doing any additional color. I do want these speckles to set, and so I am going to steam set it first. Here's my bundle, and I'm going to put it into my steamer pan and let it steam for about 30 minutes. It's been about 30 minutes, so I'm going to pull this out and let it completely cool before opening it. The front side of this yarn looks great. So now I'm going to go ahead and flip it over, and here's what the back of it looks like. Now, in some areas there looks to be some good penetration, and in other areas it's really much more light. So I've decided I'm just going to add some general color using the spray bottles with the oranges and reds and yellows, just kind of randomly placed throughout. Then I'm going to speckle over the top of it with greens and browns and blacks. All right, I have finished speckling and adding some additional color to the back side of the blank. And here's what some of those speckles look like. Here's those black speckles. I've tried black speckling before, but they often break. This time they didn't, so I'm really pleased with how this has turned out. Here's my little package ready for the steam bath. I'm going to pop it into the steamer and let it steam for about 30 minutes, and then I'll let it cool completely and we'll wash it. All right, while my first skein is finishing off steaming and setting, I'm going to start on the second skein. For my second skein of yarn, I'm going to do a low immersion type of space dyeing kind of thing with the with that second 100-gram skein of yarn. So I'm going to put it into this shallow baking dish in this sort of Z or S formation to then add the dye onto the yarn in this formation. So I'm just going to use my leftover dyes from my stenciling project to add color to this skein. So yeah, I'm going to turn it so that I'm putting this color on the edge. But before I do, I am going to add some warm water to my skein of yarn. My skein of yarn has been pre-soaked in about 12 cups of water that has about a 1/4 cup of vinegar in it. So it has acid already in the fiber, ready to take up this dye. I want there to be just barely enough water in it so that the dye that I add will start to move around a little bit, but generally stay in the area that I put it. As I continue to add more of this dye to this skein, there will be more volume of water, and so the color will mix and mingle a lot more as I move along in this process. I'm going to start with my lighter color, which was the yellow, and I am going to kind of push it into the lower layers of the fiber so that there's some good penetration. Next, I'm going to use a spoon just to kind of help move the color around a little bit on the fiber, push the fiber down into the lower layers of the yarn, just to kind of help move it around a little bit. Now next I'm going to go with my reddish color on the other side of the yarn, paying some particular attention to where that zip tie is located so that I make sure to get dye up underneath that zip tie. Sometimes those zip ties can create a resist, and so I want to make sure that there's no that the dye gets in underneath that zip tie. And I'm also going to use the spoon to kind of help massage that color around a little bit. I'm okay if it mixes over to the yellow and creates kind of an orangish tint. I'm all right with that. But I do kind of want to leave that DMZ between the yellow and the red, even though there's a little bit of travel of that color across that white section. So I'm going to continue adding a little bit of the red color to this and massaging that into the fiber. When I'm done adding some of this color, and I think I'm almost done with what I'm going to add on this side, I'm going to let it heat in on the stove here for a little while to help set those colors. These bright colors sometimes take a little bit longer time on in the heat to be able to truly set. So I'm going to cover it and let it heat. My yarn has been heating for probably about 15 minutes. So I'm going to check to see if we have good color absorption. And I don't see any dye hanging out in my dye bath at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and remove some of the water and then flip it over and add some color to this second side. I'm going to continue adding additional color to this flip side and massaging that color into the fiber. I know there's going to be some white left over. On this side, I'm actually going to bring in that burnt orangey brown that I had used at the end of the stencil dyeing, and kind of massage that around into the fiber. It's not going to be consistent. It's just going to be kind of a pop of color. I am going to massage it down into the fiber a little bit. But one thing you'll notice that is as I'm adding more and more liquid to the fiber, the color is washing around a little bit more, which is perfectly what I'm trying to go for, is just more of a diffuse color and not, specific lines. With the last of my dye added, I'm going to add a good splash of some vinegar to the pot and mix that around a little bit just to help this color bind into the fiber with the heat. So next in this process, it's basically just let it set in this hot water and let it continue to warm until the color has set, and then I'll go in for the last part of what I plan on doing with this skein. My skein of yarn has been heating for probably about 40 minutes. I just wanted to make sure that the dye was well set into this fiber, and my dye bath has definitely cleared, so I'm going to go ahead and move the fiber out of the dye pot and let it cool a little bit. The color is great. I love that orangey brown fading into yellows and reds, still with some patches of white and undyed sections. I'm going to do some things with that here in just a moment with some speckling. So I didn't realize I hadn't turned on my camera, so I have done some speckling on this space dyed skein of yarn with some of the leftover sugar sprinkles that I have created with food coloring. So I'm just going to continue to add some sprinkles to some of the barer areas, but I'm also kind of just putting it all over, just to kind of play with some speckling techniques. And I have done some speckling in the past, or at least attempted to do some speckling in the past, using low immersion, and have found that, especially with black, that it breaks too much. And so I'm wanting to do this somewhat dry speckling. I mean, the yarn is still quite damp, but to do this somewhat drier speckling to see if I can prevent that black from breaking so dramatically. Working with black food coloring as a dye is really difficult because it's just not formulated for fiber dyeing. It's formulated for food. So that and black is hard to get without a professional dyes for fiber. So that's what I'm doing. I'm adding some additional color. I'm going to let this set and let those speckles set into the yarn. So I have had an idea that I'm going to try out, and because the sugar sprinkles don't necessarily dissolve well, I'm going to try with putting a little bit of vinegar water into my spray bottle and spraying it directly onto those sugar sprinkles to help them dissolve and set into the fiber a little more quickly. Now it's time to flip my skein of yarn over and do some additional speckling on the flip side. And I'll continue kind of moving that around, adding speckles, maybe adding a bit more vinegar water using the spray bottle until I have the level of saturation of speckles that I'm looking for and that make me happy. With my speckling done, I'm going to go ahead and wrap my plastic wrap around the skein of yarn, wrap it up into a bundle, and then I will steam it on the stove to get it good and hot and set those speckles into the yarn. It is now time to wash or rinse my the sock blank that I dyed using the stencil and the spray bottles. It is completely cool now, and so I'm going to start by doing just a quick rinse in the cold water that was in my tub. This is actually just the soak water from the second skein, so it has some vinegar in it. So I'm just kind of giving it that extra little vinegar bath to help, do a little bit of setting of that color. I'm going to then start rinsing to number one, rinse out any excess dye that might be in the fiber, as well as rinsing out the vinegar and to check for any bleeding. Now, one thing I have noted as I've started washing this sock blank, and this is the first time I've really been doing much with a flat sock blank like this. I've only done one other. At least for this one that I have made, I'm finding that I need to be careful with it potentially unraveling. So that can be a bit of a danger, at least that's what I'm finding. I'm going to add a little bit of clear dish soap, a very mild dish soap, to help wash the excess acids out of the fiber and any excess dye. If any bleeding is going to occur, this will often trigger that to occur. At this point, there hasn't been any significant bleeding in this fiber, so I'm very happy with how it's turning out so far. I'm really not seeing any significant bleeding. There might be a little bit of yellows or greens, but for the most part, the water is remaining clear, and so I'm just going to finish washing the soap out of this fiber, and then I will hang this to dry. And there are a few more things that we will do with it at the end before we turn it back into a skein of yarn. With my second skein of yarn fully cooled after it's steaming, I am now ready to rinse it. This time I'm just going to be rinsing it in some cool water to check for an initial bleeding, remove any excess dyes from the speckling and from the space dyeing, and just sort of any excess dye that may not have set into the yarn. I am seeing just a slight hint of some yellows coming out of this fiber, and so I'm going to continue doing some rinsing of this fiber. I will add a little bit of dish soap to see if any additional color starts to come out. One thing you can do if you're rinsing your fiber and you're finding some significant bleeding is you can put it back into a bath or back into a dye pot with just some water and vinegar and reheat it, or you could soak it for about 20 minutes in vinegar water and pop it into the microwave to get it hot again. Let it fully cool and then try the rinse process again. Many times that will finish setting any of the color into your fiber. And for me, most of my experience with bleeding is that I will often use more dye than is necessary for the amount of yarn that I have. And so because I was using leftover dye and basically used all of it, that very well may account for why I'm having a little bit of bleeding from this fiber, is that there was probably a little more dye than necessary for the amount of yarn that I had. I'm going to finish up rinsing the soap out of this yarn and hang it up to dry, and we'll look at the dry yarn in a little bit. So here's my dry stenciled sock blank. I really like how it looks on the front side, and the back side looks great too. Again, I don't have as much stenciling coming through, but that additional color that I added looks great. I could have just left the sock blank all knitted up, but I have unraveled it to take a look at the fiber in its finished product. And I really, really, really love how speckled this fiber looks. I have not seen anything like this in anything that I've done before. So this was great. I love how this looks. Now, one of the natures of working with a sock blank and having it unraveled is that you get a lot of crimp to the fiber. But you can also see how no one stitch is saturated with color. And so that's going to make this seem really cool when knit up. I can't wait to find a project to make use of this. To help get rid of this crimp, I'm going to rewash this skein of yarn in some cool water and then allow it to hang dry like I do with all of my skeins of yarn, in hopes that some of that crimp will relax a little bit. The second skein of yarn looks really, really nice. There are still some white patches, which will be really interesting, as well as some really nicely defined speckles. As you look closer, you can really see those different colors popping out of greens and blacks and a little bit of browns in the different areas. Here is that first skein of yarn that's been washed and relaxed a little bit. You can see that it is not near as crimpy as it once was. I really enjoyed the process of dyeing these two skeins of yarn. I think they are really pretty. They really do complement one another in some ways. I really love how the first skein of yarn is so speckly because of the nature of how it was dyed. But I also like the second skein in that it allowed me to play with some speckles in a way that I got more of the results that I was looking for. I really enjoyed dyeing this particular skein of yarn and experimenting with a sock blank, stenciling, and spray bottles. But I also like this skein of yarn because it allowed me to play with some space dyeing and also get much more comfortable doing speckling in a way where colors aren't breaking. These two skeins of yarn are really beautiful. I can't wait to make use of them in a project or two separate projects. I hope you've enjoyed watching me dye these skeins of yarn, and I hope you're enjoying this channel. If you do like this video, be sure and click that thumbs up button. And if you like the content you're finding on my channel, be sure to subscribe and click that bell icon to get notifications of when I upload new content. I really enjoy and are happy that you have joined me today, and I hope you come back. get out there and dye some yarn and have fun.